Hello and welcome to Todd in a Box. Odd title, I know, but it's 25 years of my experience, my thinking, my successes, my failures, all wrapped into modules so you can follow and chase and achieve your dream of writing a book. Now, I know you all have great ideas, otherwise, you wouldn't be here. You may have life experiences that can change the world. You may have story ideas that can influence a generation. You may have the most brilliant, prescriptive message existing today in this world to change everything. And I applied all of it. I'm with you. I love nothing more than a person in a dream. But after so many requests and so many phone calls and so many conversations, I finally thought, you know what? I need to put all of this information I've gleaned throughout my lifetime and my career, I need to put it into modules so other people can learn it. Because so many times I get on calls with people and I realize they're missing some of the basics about writing a book. So we're going to start with one simple question. Why are you here? Well, you know why you're here. You believe you have something. You believe you have a story. Maybe it's a personal story. Maybe it's a totally fictional story about aliens and science fiction stuff and crazy dragons and wizards and whatever it may be. Maybe it's some sort of business solution that you think you can change the way people lead. Maybe it's something more social. Maybe it's a political message. Maybe it's who knows, maybe it's a prescription that you have and you can say, I know how to teach people how to lose weight better or cure heart disease or whatever the case may be. Whatever it is, you know why you're here. The question I want to ask you is, do you know why you want to write a book? Because yes, your information should be shared. Your story should be shared. Your brilliance should be shared. And believe me, I've heard pitches from around the world. People call me all the time and they say, Todd, I have an idea for a book. I love it. But oftentimes, I ask them that very first question, why a book? Well, maybe it is a book. Maybe it's a podcast. Maybe it's a video series. I don't know the answer to that yet. Maybe you don't yet. But through this series, you're going to figure it out. And I do believe, in the end, that through this thought process, through my experiences, you're going to discover a brilliant book. It may not start as a book, but eventually we'll get there. We're going to talk about things like average book sales for both nonfiction writers and fiction writers. Because oftentimes we look at those great successes in the world and we say, look at so-and-so, they're selling 5.8 million copies. Guess what? That's not standard. It's not even close to average. We'll talk about all that. We'll also talk about what it takes mentally, emotionally, structurally during your day to write one word after the other, and 50,000 of them, on average, to make one concise thought through an entire book. Because the point of a book is very linear thinking. It's word after word, sentence after sentence, paragraph after paragraph, and chapter after chapter. And all of those things need to line up in order to have a good book. We're also going to talk about story because you're all here for numerous reasons. And I'm going to tell you right now, there's a secret you need to understand that no matter what it is that you want to put into a book, none of it's worth anything if you don't have a good story. What do I mean by that? I mean that if you're a fiction writer, that makes sense. If your story isn't good, your book's not going to sell. That's very clear. But what if you're a nonfiction writer? How important is your story? It's extremely important. Say you're a chef. How important is it for you to tell your story? Why should someone choose your recipes? Why are you more interesting than the other chef? If you're a business leader, same thing. What's your story? What are your credentials that give you the insights to write about, talk about, teach others about that thing that you want to teach the world about? Your story, and you know this, because we see celebrity types doing this all the time and we say, why do they get to write a children's book? Well, because everyone knows their name. And this is a harsh truth to understand, but your story is one of the major factors of you getting a publishing deal. Your story is one of the major factors of when you get your book up on Amazon, of why people say, hey, I want to listen to Joe or Samantha's life story. That sounds interesting because of their story. Question is, do you know how to tell your story? Well, you'll learn through these modules. You'll learn through Todd in a Box, because I've been there with numerous authors, including myself, over and over and over again about how to pitch your own story. Before we get into my story, which you've probably already read a little bit about, you've heard about all the best-selling books, you've heard about some of the big players that I've been able to work with in my career, which has been awesome, a learning experience I could have never purchased. I want to tell you about a story about a guy that you've never heard of. Okay, it's actually a haunting story. The guy's name is Ray. Ray went to medical school. Not because he wanted to, but because it was basically a family business. His grandfather was a doctor, his father was a doctor, and Ray grew up with a family's expectation that Ray would also become a doctor. Ray did not want to become a doctor. Ray instead wanted to become an architect. In his free time, he would draw crazy artistic buildings. He was passionate when he would visit cities to go visit different iconic pieces of architecture. But he went through med school, just like his family had expected him to do. In his first job out of med school, he got a job working overnights at a small ER out in the middle of the country, farming community outside of Oklahoma City. Ray didn't get to see much action as a doctor working the midnight shift. Most of the time, he was chit-chatting with nurses, maybe playing cards. Once in a while, treating somebody for the flu or a farming accident. He told me that he had treated one guy for chopping off a few fingers, some equipment. But night after night, day after day, Ray began to hate his family, resent them, because now he was stuck in a future that he did not want to be a part of. This went on for months. Night after night, boredom after long boredom after long boredom, Ray began to resent his family even more, day in and day out. Now one night on the freeway just outside of town, there was a pileup of cars and semi-trucks. Ray heard over the scanner that the ambulances and fire trucks and everyone had been hauled out to this crash. I think it was 5 or 6 car pileup, middle of the night. And so the hospital gets warned that they're bringing in patients. Most of them are okay. One of them is critical. So Ray realizes for the first time in his life that his job is to save the life of someone else. And there's no one else in the hospital that can do it. All the responsibility falls on Ray's shoulders, and this is where Ray is sitting there waiting for the ambulance to arrive, thinking, this is not the place I want to be. It's not the place I've ever wanted to be. I've never wanted to take responsibility for someone else's life. Why on earth did I do this? Ray's standing at the end of the hallway. He watches the flashing lights outside the windows come screaming up to the hospital doors. He watches the nurses run out and the ambulance drivers rush the patient into the hospital. They rush him into the operating room, and Ray does all of his tests and try to figure out what's going on. Seconds go by, minutes go by. Ray does everything he can. And the man on the operating table dies. Now Ray feels horrible, guilty, responsible. It was his job to save a life. Now, worse than that, after the man is declared dead, the head nurse looks up at Ray and says, it's your job to inform the family. So Ray's thinking, oh great, now I have to do the hardest thing in my life. Ray walks out to the lobby. Ray sees an older woman sitting there. Ray walks up to her, kneels down in front of her, and says, I'm sorry, Mom. I couldn't save Dad's life. Now, I tell you this story for a few reasons. First of all, if you listen closely, there's a lot of holes in it, right? There's a lot of holes. You're thinking about Ray's resentment towards his parents and how the fact that he didn't want to be a doctor, and then, well, what does that resentment do when you're trying to save somebody's life who you've built up all this resentment toward, and then it's his parents who are coming to visit him? A lot of holes. I tell you that story for 2 reasons. One, because you can take the point of that whole story as live your dreams. Follow your passion. That's why you're here today, because you're passionate about telling your story or writing that book. And that's awesome. But 2, and the main reason I tell you that story is because that story, with all of its holes, was the first story I ever published. Yeah, I wrote it when I was like 14 years old. I didn't know what I was talking about. It got published. And guess what? It won awards. With all of its holes, it won awards. But what did it do for me? And this is where I want to go back to, are we writing a book? Is this what you want to do? Because what that story did for me, those awards did for me, was tell me, hey, I did something short. I did something not perfect. I knew at the time that I could have written it way better. I could have told that story in such a better form and whatever. But what it did for me is to make me say, wow, I can make stuff up in that scenario because it's fictional and people will consume it. People will applaud me for it. So when you're thinking about writing your book, the first thing I want to ask you is, do you write? Because it's fine and dandy to have great ideas, but have you ever sat down and said, if I have a story, maybe I should test it out? Today's world, with our technology, there are a bazillion places to publish something. See if you get a reaction. Now, I know a lot of people have called me and they've said, hey, Todd, I'm really worried that someone's going to steal my story. Well, that's something to be concerned about if it's all fictional. But if it's your story, if it's your personal story that you think the world should hear about, no one can steal your story. It's your voice. It's only you that can tell it. Through these modules, we're going to talk about a lot of different things. We're going to talk about your audience. We're going to talk about what it is that you want to accomplish with your book. Is it money? Is it fame? Is it service? Are you trying to help a certain aspect of the population? We're also going to talk about publishing, because I get a lot of calls. Hey, Todd, should I do the traditional publishing route where someone buys the rights to my book and then they sell it all over the place? Or should I self-publish where I own all the rights? We'll talk about the pros and cons of each. We'll talk about your title. Because ultimately, you know that old saying that says something about buying a book for the cover or something like that? Guess what? All books are bought because of the cover, because of the title. If your title doesn't sing, no one's going to buy your book. And I can tell you this, I've worked with so many authors in the past who have great, great content, and their titles just, it makes you want to poke your eyes out. We're going to talk about outlining, things that a lot of people don't want to do. But it's extremely important because, again, a book is a linear thing. It's word for word all the way to the end. If the 3 words before the 4th word don't do the 4th word justice, someone won't get to that 4th word. We'll talk about a business plan for your book. We'll also talk about storytelling. Why are some stories repeated over and over and over while others just kind of fall flat? Or they're good for one time? But other stories, other movies, for example, why can you watch, Forrest Gump, the movie, over and over and over, and every time it's still just as entertaining? We're going to talk about tone as it relates to you, as it relates to your voice, and as it relates to your audience. We're also going to talk about something that I think is extremely important in keeping a reader's attention, and you may think it's weird, but it's rhythm. What is the rhythm in your writing that keeps a reader going, that makes them forget that they're actually reading? Because I'll tell you this, the simplest books to read are the most powerful because you forget that you're actually reading. If you have to struggle through a book to understand what an author is saying, most likely you won't finish reading it. We're going to talk about structure, we're going to talk about work, we're going to talk about editing, we're going to talk about finishing, and then we're going to talk about the real work. Once that book is done, that's when the sweat comes in, because now you have to find an audience, you have to sell that book. I'll also include modules on things like public speaking, which I do a lot of, ongoing book promotion, online book promotion, how to build an online audience, and then offshoot products. Like, are you onto something that's much, much bigger? You very well may be. Today, you might be setting up the rest of your career, the rest of your life, the rest of your identity, and the rest of your legacy. But today is where we start with your story, your book, your idea. Giddy up. Let's go. This is your dream.